let's just take a look at this one more time just for a little bit more clarification, and take a look at it in a little bit different way. When we're looking at our Class A IP address and our Class A mask that we're using to steal our IP addresses, really what we're doing is this octet is letting us know that we're stealing any IP addresses with this same first octet, and then the 0.0.0 lets us know on to the end. So these are the addresses that we're stealing from our public IP address range to use as private IP addresses. Because this is an address, when we're looking at our public address ranges for Class A, Class B, and Class C, that's in those public address ranges. But you can't use them as a public address because we're stealing, for our private IP addresses, our IP addresses that start with 10.0.0.0, use our mask here and say, okay, any public addresses that start with this same first octet, we're going to use. So that includes everything from the beginning here all the way to the end. It's almost as if we didn't have that second part. We didn't have our end range, and we just gave you this first address and said, okay, here's a Class A public IP address. You're allowed to use this address with this subnet mask as private IP addresses. So we're allowed to use this public address, 10.0.0.0, and then take all the addresses that a subnet mask of 255.0.0.0 would give us. So that gives us the addresses in the range of 10.0.0.0 through 10.255.255.255. It's fortunate for us that when we're actually doing addressing, our default subnet mask is the same for Class A ranges, for Class A addresses. So when we're looking at the Class B private IP address range, it's the same thing, except it's a little bit harder to see here because we're actually, the 240, we would need to break it down into the binary to understand it a little bit better, which we will in the CIDR notation. Our IP address start point for our private IP address range is going to be 172.16.0.0. That's the address that we came up with, and we said, okay, this is our start address for our private IP address range from our public addresses that you can steal for private IP addressing. And we're going to let you use any private IP addresses when we take this binary, and you can use any of the addresses here. So we split it up. We split it up right there. This 240, actually, when we break it down into the binary, changes the way our numbers work a little bit. That's why we are at a .16 and not a .0, because of this 240 in binary. We're actually stealing the first two binary digits. So it's a little bit complicated. We won't get too in depth with it. We don't want to get too much more confused. But we're able to use for our private IP address range anything starting here. And because in the subnet mask, when we calculate it out, lets us know, okay, this works from here all the way to here, 172.31.255.255. When we're using addresses in this range for our actual IP addressing and making our networks and making our hosts, then we're using this mask. Now, why don't we just use this mask and throw it on this address? It'd make it a lot easier to remember things, right? It would make it a lot easier to not get confused. Well, if we took this same address, this 255.255, and threw it here and only took addresses in that range, then we would only be able to use private addresses of 162. Whichever dot, we would actually have to choose a number here. So we could say we could only use addresses of 172.16.0.0 through 172.16.255.255. Using 240 here, when we stole the addresses, gives us a lot more ranges of IP addresses and potential networks. It gives us an additional, we have 16 to 31 here, that when we use our default IP subnet mask, we now have And we now have 15 networks that we can create. We can create networks we can create network 172.16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. You get the idea. All the way to 31. We can create all those networks and then have hosts in our 0.0 range. But when we stole the addresses, we used 255.240 so we could get a little bit more. Then class C, our range for our private IP addresses are going to be 192.168.0.0 through 192.168.255.0. Now, again, we started with just our 192.168.0.0, used this mask and said, okay, you can steal any of the addresses that start with this same, these first two octets, and all the way to the end. And that calculated out to 192.168.255.255. So when we use our default class C subnet mask of 255.255.255.0, that allows us to have 255 different networks that we can set up, because we're able to take these different we're able to take this third octet, which will by default still be a network octet when we're IP addressing, and we can increment those anywhere from our 0 to 255. So it actually gives us 255 of our different potential, or 256 of our potential different networks. And then our last octet will be our host. Now, and then we say again, well, why didn't we just take this and just steal the number of addresses here? Wouldn't it be easier to remember? Well, maybe, but then if we only stole the addresses using this mask, then we wouldn't have 192.168.0.0 through 192.168.255.255 to use. If we using this mask, we would only have 192.168.0.0 through 192.168.0.255. So by giving us that little extra room, we have a lot more potential networks and a lot more potential hosts to use for our private address range. But so hopefully this helps clarify it a little bit more. I felt the need to tack on this little extra segment after the first way I explained it, to help if you were still a little bit confused. If this confused you more, I'm sorry. If this helped you out, if this helped make it a little bit more clear, then that's great. If you're still a little bit confused and still a little bit not understanding a bit, then just the key points to remember, the key thing to take away from this whole board here right now, is that our Class A private range, when we're looking at IP addresses, if an IP address is anything in between 10.0.0.0 through 10.255.255.255, it's a private IP address. And I'm covering up what's underneath that, because if you're confused, these are the two takeaways you need, or these are the couple takeaways you need to get from this. This is going to be our private range, and when you are addressing an IP address in that range, this will be your default subnet mask. With our Class B addresses, if you're looking at an IP address in a Class B range, and it is 172.16.0.0 through 172.31.255.255, that's a private address. And if you see an address like that, by default, its subnet mask is going to be this, unless we're doing subnetting. But this is classful addressing we're talking about right here. And then lastly, our Class C range, if you see an address anywhere in the span of 192.168.0.0 through 192.168.255.255, then by default, your IP address, or your subnet mask you're going to use for IP addresses in that Class C range is going to be this. So if everything else totally blew your mind or went out the window, or I didn't explain well enough or in depth enough or too in depth and made it too complicated, then those are the takeaways you need to get from this so that you can move on to the next couple modules and understand subnetting better. So hopefully this helped, and let's go ahead and move on to our next segment.